Let me tell you about a man named Frank. Now, Frank lived over 100 years ago, and although I don't know a whole lot about him, here's what I do know. He lived in New Jersey. He was a patriot, and he answered his country's call during the Spanish-American War. He was a doctor. He was an osteopath. And he died during the flu pandemic of 1919. Frank was just an average American man who got caught up in the global pandemic, much like the one we're going through right now. Now, Frank had two sons, one named Lloyd and one named Paul. And when Frank and his wife died in the pandemic, Lloyd and Paul were orphaned at a pretty young age. I think one was 4, one was 6. And growing up without parents is hard, but apparently these two boys made the best of it. Paul grew up in the 1920s and 1930s. He ended up working for a while as a cowboy. He did odd jobs here and there, like construction. He got married. He had 3 kids. Paul was just a normal, average American guy. Now, one of Paul's sons was named Keith. And Keith ended up being a teacher, a pretty good teacher from what I understand, and he also got married. He also had a son. And that son was me. And if you had looked at the demise of Frank Plummer in 1919, you might have said, wow, what a shame. What a tragedy. I mean, there's nothing good that can come out of this. Because, when you're staring a global pandemic in the face, it's easy to be discouraged. It's easy to look at the darkness surrounding you. Nothing good can come out of this. Not with sickness and death and the inability to go to church on a weekly basis. It looks bleak. But I beg to differ. All right? Although I didn't know him, my great-grandfather, he must have been a good man. Because see, as a doctor, he saw it as his duty to brave the conditions, to brave the threats, and serve his patients who were in need. And eventually that killed him. But before he died, he must have instilled some good values into his boys, values that eventually made their way down to me and helped shape me into the man I am now. And so right now, you have incredible power to shape the next generation, not to mention to shape the world around you, even in the face of darkness. See, you and I have a responsibility to pass on our values and our love for the God who sustains us. Throughout the Psalms, we are commanded to tell future generations about the Lord. Psalm 22:30. Psalm 71:18, Psalm 78:4, Psalm 145, verses 3 and 4, all charge us to tell the next generation about God's mighty acts, the great things He's done in our lives in the past and in the present. Joel 1:3 says this. It says, tell it to your children. Let your children tell it to their children and their children to the next generation. And really, that's what history is all about. We tell stories about who we are and what has shaped us into who we are. Now, I didn't know Frank Plummer, but his story informs my story. And he may have died in the pandemic 100 years ago, but his legacy lives on in me. And in the same way, the great leader Moses said a long time ago in the book of Deuteronomy, read up on what happened before you were born. Dig into the past. Understand your roots. Ask your parents what it was like before you were born. Ask the old ones. They'll tell you a thing or two. So as you are sheltering in place, as you're social distancing, as you're working from home or dealing with the other disruptions in your life, take the time to think about the legacy you're going to live. Take the time to think about the example you're setting. What are you teaching your kids? What kind of example are you teaching your kids right now? How are you treating your spouse with the stresses we're all going through? How good a friend or neighbor are you being? Let's be honest, none of this is fun to go through, right? But it doesn't have to be dark. It doesn't have to be bleak. Be the light to this generation and the ones to come.